I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Dr. Jake Sotiriadis, Director of the Center for Futures Intelligence at National Intelligence University. Jake is a frequent speaker on global futures and intelligence and founded the U.S. Air Force's Strategic Foresight and Futures team. Jake is a futurist, thought leader, and intelligence expert, and teaches courses on international relations, intelligence tradecraft, and geopolitical futures. He's also an advisor to the State Department and teaches at the Foreign Service Institute. He leads a team that helps senior leaders in the intelligence community, the Department of Defense, and the State Department to help them embrace uncertainty and build anticipatory thinking. Jake's work has been featured internationally in The National Interest, The Diplomat, Defense News, China-US Focus, and many other media venues. So Jake, welcome. Let me start out by thanking you for your time today as well as your career of service. And from a futurism perspective, let me start by asking, what are the emerging trends and technologies that you are most excited about right now? What are the biggest, best, and the most cool, I guess?
Tim, thanks so much for having me. I know we've been talking for a little while. It's a pleasure to finally have this discussion with you. And, it's an exciting time, frankly, to be a human being right now and to live in this unique period of history that we are in right now. I'll tell you what, I am excited about a lot of things. I am very, very excited with all of the possibilities that extended reality, immersive experiences are going to bring for us. I mean, right now, I think we're in the midst of, maybe not even in the midst of, we're really scratching the surface on the potential of all of these technologies right now. I think everything from how we experience learning to how we communicate, how we consume information, how we make decisions in the future, all of those processes and cycles are really going to be underpinned by an immersive type environment. Whether that is the metaverse as people are describing it now, which I'm not sure we know exactly what that is just yet, or another type of environment. I think that's to me very, very exciting. The idea of us having digital twins or maybe even digital quintuplets at some point, and all of the challenges, frankly, though, and things we need to think about regarding intellectual property and there's so many different avenues we need to really start thinking about now to put policies in place to make sure that we are ahead of some of the technological developments, which is typically what governments are not good at. But it is an exciting time. I mean, I just look at my own, I have two children that are 10 and 8 years old, and I see how engaged and how digitally literate and excited they are about everything. And I just am blown away by it almost looks like an innate ability that they have to just familiarize themselves with a lot of these technologies, certainly way ahead of where we were at their ages.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I have a 13-year-old daughter, and it's the same thing. She's back and forth between the phone, her iPad, and then her desktop, and she's got her AirPods, and she's able to switch between all those machines. I mean, the level of competency at 13 is insane, right? So I think today's children are going to be tremendous leaders in terms of digital technology. There's absolutely certainty with that. Well, so one of the challenges that I had was you have such an amazing breadth and depth of knowledge and background. I mean, 20 years in the Air Force, you're teaching at National Intelligence University, you're a futurist, you follow technology. So I thought, why don't I focus in on some of the current event stuff? So let me launch into that. I want to ask about the European energy crisis, because despite the geopolitical origins of this, it seems like this might be a good motivation to help get us away from petrol energy. But it also seems like there are some limitations with the solar and wind power that people have proposed as alternatives. Do you think that nuclear is the answer? And if not, what direction should we be going?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, there are many elements, I think, to approaching that issue. Number one, no question, the vulnerability and overexposure of European markets to Russian energy is very, very apparent. I mean, and I don't necessarily think that some of the knee-jerk reaction to the conflict was very well thought out, particularly by European governments, when they just immediately said, okay, we're going to completely reduce any dependence that we have without really having put into place mechanisms to make that happen. And now, as the winter is approaching, we'll see what the cost in real terms ends up being in several European capitals. So I think a lot of this has to do with the politics, unfortunately, of dealing with of energy than the actual technologies and dependencies. So let's think about this. I mean, when we think about previous administrations in Europe, I mean, there was really little done or really little foresight given to the idea of, hey, what happens if all of a sudden we can't rely on Russia to meet our energy demands? And certain voices had mentioned this or had warned of this, but we can see that it took a seismic shift like the invasion of Ukraine to make people start thinking seriously about it. But what that does, though, is it brings other players, for example, Azerbaijan, in regions like the South Caucasus, which is volatile for its own reasons, but makes that region that much more important in terms of being an energy provider to European markets. So there's definitely some bigger and second and third order effects to think about. I don't know if nuclear is, for example, the answer, but I think it needs to be an answer. And for many, many decades in European capitals, right, this has sort of been a non-starter. You couldn't even have a discussion about, about using the nuclear technology as a viable alternative. One interesting piece of you mentioned green energy and renewables. There was a few weeks ago an interesting article that had come out showing that for a few hours, Greece itself, the entire country was running 100% on renewables for about 3 hours, right, on one day, which may seem like maybe a small accomplishment, but that's an indicator that right, you can put resources into that type of alternative energy path and have results, right? But what needs to happen now is, if people are serious about moving in that direction, there needs to be systemic level shifts to make those transitions real. And let's be very honest, I don't anticipate the conflict in Ukraine ending anytime soon. I think we could be talking about a multi-year frozen conflict. And so I think we need this. This is really the whole value proposition of futures literacy. Is we've got to start thinking differently about these issues. And frankly, this is an issue that should have already been on people's radar, and there should have been alternative solutions on the books already to be able to move in an agile way and pivot when these things come up.
Well, and I would love, let's put a pin in the frozen conflict multi-year potential in Ukraine, because that's something I absolutely want to come back to. Now, let me stick with energy for a second, though, because so one of the challenges, it seems like, is like I just recently upgraded to a Tesla when gas hit close to $6 a gallon in my area. And there are a lot of advantages to it, but one of the disadvantages is it strains the grid to put these vehicles on it, right? Because in the past, we were able to take all that energy from gas and oil, and the vehicles were able to use that directly. Now it has to go through the grid. So do you think that, do you have concerns about the grid in general? I mean, in the US, potentially, in Europe, definitely right now. Do you think that's going to strain it? Do you think that'll slow down the adoption of EVs?
I don't think it's necessarily going to slow down the adoption of EVs. I mean, we're already seeing several states, I mean, California being the most prominent, even passing legislation for purchasing, right, only EVs by, I think, in 2035. So I think the momentum is there, and certainly, there's a good value proposition for electric vehicles and moving away from gas-powered vehicles. The problem, again, is the transition, right? How do you structure a transition so that you take into factors like the grid, and also, the other side of this coin is, what do you do with, how do you dispose of these batteries at some point, right? They have to go somewhere, right? This is a problem. So it is a strain on the grid. There are environmental concerns. And then there's, in general, when you think about what are the value chains that are going to be created by this transition as well. So how do we take the existing infrastructure that we have and try to expand the range of value chains that we could get out of this transition? I mean, it's certainly an issue that isn't going away anytime soon. And unfortunately, what we're seeing yet again, right, is the technology jumping ahead of policy and bureaucracy, which is a perennial dilemma.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. Well, and again, all of these energy uncertainties in Europe, at least, have some at least partial relation to the war in Ukraine. And so, the Western nations have been importing fuel from Russia, and in the United States, we've been importing economically crucial products from China, but we're not really on good terms with either one of those nations. So, do you have any thoughts, ideas, or solutions in that area? Because it just seems tedious, I guess. And I think the war really highlights that.
Yeah, you mean in terms of the trade relationship between the
Yeah,
United States and
because
China?
they are such major suppliers, right? I mean, I think Russian fuel is, like natural gas, in their aspect of things, but also in China. With China, so many goods, products, semiconductors, all of those things are manufactured in mainland China. Really, in both of those instances,
Hmm.
we have, great rival powers, and we rely on them economically, and they rely on us economically as well. But there are these potential uncertainties, right? And the war in Ukraine shows just how rapidly we can be impacted, or Europe can be impacted by just a small change in international relations.
Absolutely. One positive note I would add on that, Tim, is that there have been many projections going back to, let's say, 2008, when we were in the middle of the great financial crisis then, that uh, China is going to overtake the US economy, that there were books were being written talking about when China rules the world and all these kinds of issues. We're not hearing those kinds of discussions anymore. And I think that speaks to the resiliency not only of the American economic machine, and to your point about energy, I mean, the United States has proven itself to be not only a producer but exporter and global energy leader. And I think that needs to be a continued way forward to make sure that the United States is able to weather the effects of global energy crises and reduce its dependence, right, on foreign sources. But if you think about for the China perspective, the projections on the Chinese economy overtaking the United States economy are certainly nowhere near where they used to be. I think the CHIPS Act that was just passed by the Congress and signed by President Biden is that's a huge tool in the United States toolkit to be able to ensure that the United States can restrict Chinese access to critical technologies and make sure that the United States can again be a leader in the semiconductor industry. The fact that there's a recognition amidst all of the noise and craziness that's happening right now in the world, and the fact that it was done in in a bipartisan way, I think is really important for maintaining the United States advantage in this area moving forward. But I'll come back to what I said before, which is that the value proposition for futures literacy really shows us that we have to constantly be thinking in an iterative way, and that when the status quo makes us feel comfortable, that's exactly the time that we need to be thinking about alternative solutions, whether that's in the energy, the economic realm, in the military realm, in the political realm, because we're living in this world that's just so complex today, where things are shifting day to day, and we have tools at our disposal to help us not only navigate the uncertainty, but innovate from it and from the future, and make better decisions if we actually implement them.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, let me return, and I should apologize for jumping around in these questions a little bit, but let me return to the Ukraine war. And again, a moment ago you mentioned frozen conflict, which I started to hear that phrase, and the other one you mentioned, it could potentially be a multi-year conflict, and this is the first time I've heard that. So I wanted to ask if you could elaborate a little bit on those. And also, I wanted to ask, what have we learned about Russia's military strength from the war so far? Do you think that they're a weaker potential adversary than we previously believed they were? or are they, in fact, maybe stronger?
Well, let me address the frozen conflict element first. Look, there's no indication at this point that that President Putin and the Russian war machine is going to stop there. And I would argue at this point, it's not necessarily in. If we look at the worldview of Vladimir Putin and the Russian establishment, right now we can look at consolidating some of the gains that have been made, but a way of protracting the conflict, is to perhaps maybe lay low for a little while, or sort of, go up back and forth on a potential negotiated settlement, while then maybe using the time that is available to try to regroup and reconstitute some of the forces that have been lost. But there really is no interest in this point, I think, from the Russian perspective, to stopping the conflict. And so if we think about it through that lens, we've got to be prepared for this being not only, maybe another year, but multi-year conflict, as we've seen with so many other wars and conflicts of the past. What we think, to your second point about the reputation, or perhaps the capabilities within the Russian armed forces, I think it's pretty clear that some of the not some, but some of the decision processes, the quality of Russian forces, troops, material, equipment, and more importantly, the dogma, war fighting dogmas, operational culture, implementation of a mission command type structure, just isn't there in the Russian armed forces. And at least and let's not forget too, the Ukrainian forces had exposure to Western training, obviously being bolstered. I mean, let's not take away the bravery and the talent that's been displayed in them in there. And one can't discount what it means to be fighting for one's homeland as well, which is
absolutely.
That certainly plays a major factor, which is almost impossible to quantify, right? Sort of when we think about the will to fight. But I think there's no question that if we would have been having this conversation in February of this year when the conflict started, most of the experts in this field and the sort of prevailing opinion was that this was going to be over in a matter of days, if not weeks, and that it was going to end in Russia's favor. And now we're reaching the point where I think it's a critical juncture, because the winter is soon going to be upon us. The Russians right now are moving towards more of an approach of destroying infrastructure. They're trying to enact a punishment strategy on Ukraine. This has been done before. It's not necessarily going to be, I think, a successful means forward. Continuing to punish populations through aerial bombardment has seldom actually led to them submitting to enemy demands. And so this is, maybe more of a way for the Russians to inflict punishment, damage, and perhaps show their own population that they're achieving some results in the face of all of the bad numbers that they frankly have in front of them.
Okay. It's the Ukraine war has been intensely interesting to me from a technology perspective as well.
Yeah.
I mean, the big one is drone warfare, right? And so, what in the past, when I think of a drone, I think of like the Reaper drone, where it's essentially an aircraft. It's remotely piloted, but it's an aircraft, and it can launch a Hellfire missile to take out, a terrorist camp or something like that. And so, it's very much a traditional aircraft model. In Ukraine, both sides are using kamikaze drones, and they're lightweight and they're cheap. I think the Russian ones, I believe it's the Shahed 136. It's an Iranian drone. They cost about $20,000 each. And then the Ukrainians actually crowdsourced the Ram 2, which again is incredibly unique. So they're leveraging a lot of 21st century technologies, and they're going towards these cheap, disposable, lightweight drones in mass numbers. Do you think that this is kind of a paradigm change in how drones and automation are going to be used in warfare in the future?
Look, I think the paradigm shift was already here, and now people are starting slowly to recognize that we're in we've been in this transition for a while. I mean, we can even go back to the 2020 war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, where we saw the Azerbaijani forces employing drones very, very effectively. You had the Armenian armed forces, which had Russian equipment, Russian doctrine, a lot of older equipment, but larger tank formations and infantry formations that didn't hold up very well against the combination of targeted, providing targeting data via drones or actual strikes from drones. So, I mean, this is clearly going to influence the way wars are fought in the future. But also, let's not discount the information domain, which is so critical. The rapid dissemination of information in real time, and using that information for effect on the battlefield. The narrative war, right? The narrative warfare that's so important, that the Ukrainians have been so effective at in terms of garnering support for their cause on the global stage. All of those factors, I think, are very important. But with respect to drones, I think probably the biggest showstopper from the conflict was when we saw the Russian flagship in the Black Sea taken out by a drone attack, which really ought to give us all pause when we think about these big, expensive platforms, technically advanced platforms. At the same time, they're vulnerable. They're extremely vulnerable, and they're being picked away by very cheap, technologically cheap platforms, like you mentioned with drones. So there's no question that I'm sure global militaries around the world and security experts are going to continue to monitor and look at the situation, because it is going to outline, this is the Ukraine conflict's been the biggest conflict we've seen in Europe since 1945, and these technologies will continue to remain game changers.
Yeah. Well, and the technologies themselves are game changers. A lot of the same technologies that are being used in drones are also being used here at home commercially. And so I've been following that. I'm really excited about EVTOLs, right? Point-to-point commuter transport in the skies, or the proverbial flying car, if you will, which is only about 80 years overdue at this point. But so Wisk and Joby are a couple of the companies working on those. They're doing air taxis, and then the Chinese EHang, if I'm pronouncing that right, and then Jetson One are working on personal transportation, which I think is more exciting in terms of potentially replacing the automobile for at least some commuter applications. Do you have any thoughts on when we might see those emerge in the commercial market? Any guesstimates?
Well, as you mentioned, there are some exciting headlines coming out. Lots of innovative companies really running with this technology and trying to get prototypes and models out into markets. I think there's still, before we start seeing a lot of this stuff mainstreamed. We don't forget, we're still working on legislation that would determine airspace regulations for private drones here in the United States, right? We still haven't quite cracked that code yet in terms of, you still don't see on a wide scale, distribution of goods and supplies yet via drone in domestic markets in the United States. So all of this, again, goes back to this point of the technologies, in many cases, being ahead of policy and decision making. So, I wouldn't make a projection per se on when we're going to see these kinds of things, but there are also feasibility issues that we have to think through. But these are all interrelated, again, to this idea of what kind of a transition do we want to see, and then if we're going to introduce these new conceptual models to the market, where are the value chains going to be? Because when you think about creating new a sort of a transportation type transformation, if you will, with new means. It's not just the technology that we're talking about, or let's say you talk about like everybody goes back to the flying car example, right? It kind of fascinates everybody, but it's really about what does that do to our notion of cities, right? What does that do to our notion of getting to work? How do we plan cities in the future? So it's these are fun issues because they're one small element of the broader topic of these value chains that are going to fuel from, the home level to the commercial level, to industrial level, to perhaps, military utility level, and all of the touch points to make that happen. So it's, these are things that we're definitely going to see continue to emerge as we go forward. But I would have kind of refrained from making a projection on when a particular item is going to hit the market.
Well, no, I think actually it's brilliant that you mentioned city planning, because that's something that's come into my mind in the past also. And so much of like, okay, where we live depends on that commute. And so if you have, like, a lot of us work remotely, but if you have a job that you have to go to, regularly, even if it's just once a week, a large part of buying a house and structuring your life goes into that commute. And so if you're able to, I mean, even theoretically, if you're able to cut that commute time in half by using one of these vehicles, if it provides other benefits there, then you can move farther out. You save money on the house. You're able to potentially have a higher standard of living. And like, we both have children, right? So one of the goals there is to have a place that's nice to raise children. You don't want them packed into the city or squished in the suburbs. So you might be able to have something that's a little bit more rural and a little bit more a little bit softer way to raise them, I guess. So those are all changes that come out of that. So thank you for mentioning the city planning aspect of it, because I think it falls out of these technologies, but it's really exciting. Well, so let me ask about Air Force technologies, because this is your alma mater, and there's a lot of really amazing stuff going on there too. The big ones, the big two, are space-based solar power, as well as AFRL's rocket cargo. Rocket cargo, I love. I think that's one of those things where anybody who learns about that has to fall in love with it. The idea of literally just putting cargo on a rocket ship and moving it from one point to another on Earth. And it sounds crazy at first, but like when I've talked to Pete Gerritsen about this, and he'd said that depending on how things are structured, and again, this goes back to infrastructure, the pricing on that could be competitive or potentially even lower than traditional transport. What are your thoughts on those as future technologies?
Well, space-based solar power, is particularly fascinating, and it isn't really a new concept. This has been something that really has been discussed and researched for a long time. The idea that we'd be able to harness the energy from the sun into the electric, really empowering everything. Imagine just having every device in your home just runs all the time, right? I mean, that it's fascinating and perhaps even a bit scary to think about. But we're at a time now where this isn't just a pie in the sky idea. It isn't something just in science fiction journals. We're actually looking at different types of technological approaches and actual feasibility studies to look at how this could be implemented. So I am a fan of that concept, and trying to harness through various approaches that solution, which would, if we're able to implement that, then of course this gets into the competition piece of who's going to control, or how is this going to happen? Which country is going to be at the forefront of making this happen? Are we going to have a consortium type approach? There are ownership issues, right? So just think about all of the elements that would be involved in that kind of a breakthrough development, and you can just see the continuing geopolitical the geopolitical competition sort of overlaid on top of this issue, as it colors, I would say, almost all of these developments, trying to stay ahead of them. Really, really, really exciting. Like, as I mentioned, earlier, just this time that we live in. So I do think, this is going to be something we're going to hear more about. If we would have been talking about it, a few years ago, people would have maybe dismissed it as sort of, just a really unrealistic type objective. But there's traction, there's palpable traction now, I think, on this particular issue that is definitely grounds for excitement.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's space-based solar power is exciting. Rocket cargo, I'm not sure about, it in a way, again, it's a really big, brilliant idea. I'm not sure if it's practical. I don't know if they'll make it work, but it is brilliant. So,
Yeah.
well, Jake, let me thank you so much for your time today. And again, let me thank you for your career of service to our country. Let me close by asking, what are the trends and technologies you think we should keep an eye on in the near future? And what are you personally looking forward to in the near future in your own career?
Well, I will say that it's a joy to be in the national security space and to influence the next generation of national security leaders, both in the intelligence community and in the armed forces. You can see the passion that they bring with them every day when they come to class. All of our, at National Intelligence University, our student body is all comes from the federal workforce. So it's the only university in the U.S. where we are able to teach, research, and publish at the top secret compartmented information level. So that's a
Okay.
unique experience that affords some really interesting dialogue and using different sources and methods to really teach tradecraft to our students. And they're inspiring. It really is inspiring to teach them, but also to learn from them because they bring their experiences to the table. And a lot of current projects and issues that they've been working on are directly relatable. So it's a great center of exchange to be the academic arm for the intelligence community. So I'm just excited about having the opportunity to focus on writing and publishing and researching and building networks and relationships, not only with other academic institutions within the academic sphere, but also a lot of the efforts that we have underway to build public-private sector relationships, and which kind of leads into the other piece of your question about emerging technologies. And this is really, I think, the other side of the equation when we talk about looking at extended reality, looking at immersive environments, looking at the potential of augmented reality. The other piece of this, we don't have time to dive into the potential power of quantum processors and what that does, which
Yeah,
really is a game changer for every aspect of of the future. I mean, I can't think of an area that isn't going to touch profoundly. So I think the one cautionary note is, when we talk about human machine teaming, and this is one of the things we look at, a lot of artificial intelligence based solutions tend to talk about automation, right? Automating human labor, capital intensive processes now by reducing the human footprint. When we do that, though, we also open up other dilemmas because we raise the burden for contextualized knowledge when I eliminate the amount of human brain power that I'm putting on a particular issue. So we've got to think through, as we're implementing these technological changes, what are the policy ramifications? And gosh, we've got to get better at developing anticipatory policy that can help us stay on pace with technological developments.
absolutely. Jake, thank you again so much for your time, sir.
Thanks for having me.